Happy Friday, everybody. Every Friday, I go through a best of 3 sideboard guide, and we're kind of just marching down the list on MTG Goldfish. So this week is going to be Azorius Control, and so this is the list that I covered in the best of 1, best of 3 meta review that I do every Monday. So this was the first place winner. And so we've got March of the Otherworldly Light ×4, 3 Steps Ahead ×4, 4 copies of Deduce, 4 copies of No More Lies, 2 copies of Temporary Lockdown, 2 copies of Tishana's Tidebinder, 2 copies of Depopulate, 3 copies of The Wandering Emperor, 1 copy of Jace, 4 copies of Memory Deluge, and 2 copies of Sunfall. This list was deciding to run a single copy of Mirrex. Some were ditching the copy of Mirrex because it makes the No More Lies kind of difficult to play on turn 2. And then as far as the sideboard goes, we've got 1 copy of Destroy Evil, 3 copies of Knockout Blow, 2 copies of Jace the Perfected Mind, 1 Farewell, 2 Rest in Peace, 2 Lockdowns, 1 Chromehose Seed Shark, 2 Tishana's Tidebinders. Oh yeah, there we go. And 1 copy of The Wandering Emperor. And so with that in mind, we're going to hop into the sideboard guide here. And if you're new to this whole experience, what I like to do is use 17 lands sorry, too much draft, Untapped, which is a tracker. And that way we can kind of lean on data instead of opinion. And I think it's pretty useful. I think that a lot of times I've appreciated the process, so I hope you do as well. All right. So like I mentioned, I like to use the tracker data Untapped. And so what I do is I look at the most common matchups on MTG Goldfish, which is a website that tracks tournament data. And at the time of creating the sideboard guide, Azorius Control was the most common pick within the tournament scene. And so we'll be doing the mirror match first. So the downside with using this technique is that there are going to be some cards that don't have data. So for example, there's no data for Knockout Blow, Destroy Evil, Chromehose Seed Shark, Tishana's Tidebinder, and 3 Steps Ahead, Rest in Peace aren't even on the list because they're new cards that we got at Outlaws of Thunder Junction. So take it with a grain of salt, right? This is to help better understand the archetype and what cards are good against which matchups. And so top of the list here, though, what the tracker data does allow you to do is look for alternatives that some are running in Azorius Control that's not in the deck list. And so we've got Realmbreaker, the Invasion Tree, is particularly good because the mirror match commonly comes down to mill. Elspeth's Smite is particularly nice for being able to get rid of the Restless Anchorage and gains you some life. We've got the Devious Cover-Up, which is a way to loop your spells. Dissipate, which exiles. I think Devious Cover-Up might exile as well. I'd have to look at that one again. But either way, any of the exile stuff, and partly why the No More Lies is particularly good, is being able to exile the Memory Deluge so that they don't get additional value from that. Some decks were running Ezram Agency Chief as an alternative threat, and then the Celestus is commonly seen in Azorius Control but was not included in this list. So there are a fair amount of options that you could explore if you so wanted to do so. And then the other thing that I can do is I can open up all archetypes, and what this does is look at the card in every deck instead of just specifically Azorius Control. And what this can do is kind of be useful if we're running low on data. For example, Tishana's Tidebinder is particularly good against Azorius Control because of it being able to silence Jace and the Wandering Emperor. And so we can see it here at the number 2 spot. And then we kind of get into some of the cards that maybe we should think about removing. And so my sideboard guide, based off of the data, I think the suggestion is that we bring in the 2 copies of Jace the Perfected Mind, we bring in 1 copy of Farewell, we bring in 1 copy of The Wandering Emperor, and we bring in 2 copies of Tishana's Tidebinder. We cut 4 copies of March of Otherworldly Light, which does work against the manland, the Restless Anchorage, and you can remove it for 1 white. However, this list was running the Demolition Fields or the Field of Ruins, and so if you already have the land hate, you don't necessarily need the March of Otherworldly Light in this matchup. Or at least that's what the data is suggesting, right? And then Temporary Lockdown is largely a dead card in this list and can be removed as well. And yeah, so as I mentioned, Jace the Perfected Mind is particularly good for milling The mirror match is a long and grindy match, and being able to mill our opponent is probably one of the better ways to defeat our opponent. And then Farewell, a lot of times people will board out the sweepers, but I think the data suggests that Farewell is relatively decent to have. And so you can replace, you can reset a board that has gotten out of control from Mirix or the Wandering Emperor. And I don't personally feel like the Wraths need to be sided out in best of 3. And Farewell also has the ability to exile graveyards, which you can use to hit your opponent's memory deluges, and can be particularly appealing for Wrath. And then the Wandering Emperor, basically the plan is to bring in all of the planeswalkers that we have, and hope that we can get around our opponent's negates and Tishana's Tidebinders that they're likely going to be sideboarding in against us. And then similarly, we can be bringing in the Tishana's Tidebinder. Notably, negate was not missing in the top 10 alternatives. So a lot of lists do run negate and then bring them in against the Azorius Control matchup. And it was interesting to see that, maybe it was okay to ditch the copies of negate, even for Azorius Control. And then as far as the weaker cards go, I mentioned March of the Otherworldly Light is largely a dead card if they don't play a creature. It can hit the manland is probably its best target. And then Temporary Lockdown, again, is largely a dead card. It can be useful to reset a board, but we still have like Depopulates and Sunfalls in the Farewell to do that, and so we don't necessarily need to lean on to the Temporary Lockdown to accomplish that task. So the next up on the list is Temur Control, and we can see here that this is a tough matchup for Azorius Control, and but we could bring in Jace the Perfected Mind, and we could bring in one copy of Farewell, as well as Wandering Emperor, and 2 copies of the Temporary Lockdown. I'll talk about them a little bit more in a second here, but we should probably be cutting the 4 copies of Deduce, and then the 4 copies of No More Lies, and then we get into No Data. As far as alternatives, we see that this list is missing Kutzel's Flanker, and some lists are preferring to run the 2 Kutzel's Flankers and 1 Rest in Peace to tech against Temur Control. And because if we can hate, this is the matchup that requires the most amount of graveyard hate. Devious Cover-Up is a positive win rate here and is missing in the list, as well as Faithful Mending, and then Get Lost, as well as the Celestis. And then if we open things up to all archetypes here, we can see that Tishana's Tidebinder is on the list, but it is below 50%. And Tishana's Tidebinder can come in as a way to silence Aftermath Analyst after they sacrifice it. But it's not necessarily going to be as beneficial as just bringing in the graveyard hate. At least that's my interpretation of the data. And which I think, that one's one that personally I'm going to use, because I've been bringing in the Tidebinder, and maybe it's not as effective at shutting down the strategy as I thought it was. And then Sunfall and the Wandering Emperor, not particularly good in this matchup. But there's a little bit of the contradicting data, right? All archetypes versus the archetype specifically for the Wandering Emperor. So what I think we should do is we should bring in the 2 copies of Jace the Perfected Mind, 1 copy of Farewell, 1 Wandering Emperor, based off of the Azorius Control specific data. If you didn't want to bring in the Wandering Emperor, that's fine. Again, this is to just help you build a sideboard strategy. We can bring in the 2 copies of Temporary Lockdown and the 2 copies of Rest in Peace. Notably, Rest in Peace was missing from the data, but I can say with relative certainty that this card should be brought in against the Temur Control deck. And then we can cut the 4 copies of Deduce and the 4 copies of No More Lies. And so Jace the Perfected Mind is probably our best win condition, similar to Azorius Control, winning through mill. And Temur Control, with all of their land cycling, thin their deck relatively well, so it makes it even easier to get the win through Jace. Farewell gives us some graveyard hate on top of the Rest in Peace, and being able to Wrath the board isn't particularly important. It's more about the graveyard hate, so it's kind of expensive for what it's doing. But the Wandering Emperor, it's unlikely that they're going to attack us at any point in the game. All of their stuff is really just sitting back, so I could see justifying not bringing in the Wandering Emperor, but being able to create the 2/2s and then give them first strike, it does help us pressure and you can exile a tapped creature. They're not going to tap their creatures very often, though. So again, the Wandering Emperor, you could kind of take it or leave it. And then Temporary Lockdown, 2 copies of. This one depends on how good your opponent is, because if they know that they're playing against Azorius Control and they're a decent player, they won't play out their Aftermath Analyst on turn 2, and then they'll wait until turn 6 to be able to get the immediate value out of the lands in the graveyard. So some people don't like to bring in the Temporary Lockdown, and it does punish them for playing Shigeki and Aftermath Analyst before turn, until later in the game. So it does have some hits. And in this matchup, I think we're really trying to take as much as we possibly can, so hoping that our opponent screws up is an okay line. But again, if you didn't want to bring in the Temporary Lockdowns, I don't blame you. But I do think that they're better than what we're sideboarding out. And then Rest in Peace should be brought in, as I mentioned. If we can eliminate their graveyard, we eliminate their loop, and it kind of gets rid of the landfall combo in the first place. And then Deduce, largely... So Deduce is best for punishing decks that are going to play around the counterspell. So you hold up the counterspell. If they play around it, then you do Deduce to draw instead. And in this matchup, we're just going to be counterspelling whatever they play, and they're not really going to be playing around it. So the No More Lies is also super awkward because they have access to a ton of mana in this archetype. So we could hope that they screw up. And this one, again, is like if you wanted to not bring in the Wandering Emperor and you wanted to not bring in the Temporary Lockdowns and you wanted to keep the No More Lies, you can find a decent target for No More Lies. But in this archetype, in this matchup, the better opponents are going to play around it, and then No More Lies largely becomes a dead card. So I think either way, you're kind of in that circumstance. Esper midrange is the third most popular match right now, and so if we look here, we can see that Deduce is particularly good in the midrange matchup, and not to point fingers or anything, right? But I remember looking at an Azorius Control sideboard guide that suggested bringing out Deduce in the midrange matchups, and so it's interesting to see data that contradicts that, and that's partly why I did this, right? Is that like everybody has an opinion about what is best to bring in which circumstance, and so here I think you want to keep the Deduce for the reason that I mentioned before of punishing them for not playing their Raffine around the counterspell and then being able to draw. So Deduce working well in this archetype. Our weakest card is probably Jace, the Perfected Mind, and we could also bring in the Wandering Emperor as well as 1 copy of Farewell, and then we hit into No More Data. And alternatives, we are missing the Hornlock Whale, and some people like to bring in the Ezram Agency Chief as well. Either way, I think bringing in more threats against Esper midrange is a good idea, because they do have counterspells, but they do eventually fall, right? And Hornlock Whale isn't particularly handy at... bouncing a Raffine and having them play the Raffine isn't that big of a deal. But if you do have the counterspells in combination with it, then it can really, like if they're playing around the counterspell and slowing down the Raffine tempo, that's good. Because this matchup really comes down to tempo. And so having the Hornlock Whales to bounce their thing and then make them play around the counterspell again is particularly good. And as far as all archetypes go here, we can see the classic Destroy Evil is above 50%, and this one is kind of an old favorite of bringing in Destroy Evil against Esper midrange. I think that its efficacy is going to be lower a little bit in the future, though, because we do see enchantments being dropped from some Esper midrange lists, while others are deciding to keep the Wedding Announcement and the Virtue of Loyalty. Not every list is, right? So, but I think for the most part, it's good to bring in the Destroy Evil. Just try to keep it in mind. Try to keep track of if you're playing against the enchantment list version. And then, notably, Chromehouse Seed Shark is missing from the data, and is probably something that you'd want to bring in against the Flyers in Esper midrange. But I'm trying to keep this away from opinion and keep this as much about what the data has to offer as I can. And notably, Temporary Lockdown also has contradicting data, which happens when you're looking at Esper midrange versus all archetypes. Azorius Control versus all archetypes. So take it with a grain of salt. And but we could probably bring out the Tishana's Tidebinders. They're not looking particularly good. And so I think the data here suggests that we bring in the Wandering Emperor, 1 copy of Farewell, and Destroy Evil, and we cut the Jace, the Perfected Mind. The match is unlikely to last until we can mill out our opponent, and we're just trying to survive their tempo. And then we could cut the 2 copies of Tishana's Tidebinder. So the Wandering Emperor, being able to exile their threats makes it a pretty good thing to bring in against the mid-range, and whatever they're pumping with Rafine, exiling that as well is particularly useful. And if you go back and you look at my sideboard guide for Azorius Control that I did last time, you'll notice that I suggested removing Farewell as well as Temporary Lockdown. And with the inclusion of Duelist of the Mind, and whether or not they're running the enchantments Wedding Announcement and Virtue of Loyalty, it will change what sideboard is recommended, which is why I try to do these every 2 months or so. And so like Temporary Lockdown is looking better because of there being more 2-drops, like the Fairy Mastermind being played as well. Whereas Farewell and Destroy Evil are looking a little bit worse, because if you're up against the enchantment list version, you may not want to sub those in, and instead you may want to sub in the Temporary Lockdowns. So I'll kind of leave that one up to you. Right now, the suggestion is to bring in Destroy Evil and Farewell, because the enchantment version is the more common one. Just keep an eye out on it over time. And then Jace the Perfected Mind, as I mentioned, their plan is to out-tempo us, so the game won't last long enough to be determined by mill. And then Tishana's Tidebinder doesn't have a lot of really great targets. We can silence Rafine, but it doesn't really get it off the board. And then the body is not particularly good at slowing their pressure. Next up, we've got Domain, and here we can see Jace the Perfected Mind should be brought in, as well as 2 copies of Temporary Lockdown, and a Wandering Emperor, and then cut the 4 copies of Deduce. So I think the data is showing that the Deduce is actually weakest in the control matchups, as opposed to, in certain control matchups. It was fine in Azorius Control, but worse in Temur Control and Domain, which are both control decks that are trying to go longer. So they're more likely to be playing around the counter spells, is what I'm trying to get at. So that one contradicts some of the sideboard guides that I've seen. So that's why I'm focusing on Deduce. And then as far as no data, we see low data again for Chromhost Sea Shark. And alternatives, we see some options. So Sunset Revelry can kind of slow down their immediately destroying us through the Topiary Stomper, buy us some time. Soul Partition can be useful for bouncing and making things cost more. We've got Negate, which is missing from the list, which would be a classic one to bring in against Domain to answer the herd migrations. And then Celestis for a little bit of filtering and life gain is handy in this matchup as well. As far as all archetypes go, we can see the Depopulate is not particularly good, and nothing really popping out though as far as like anything else extra to bring in. And then notably Tishana's Tidebinder and Chromhost Sea Shark are missing in the data. Tishana's Tidebinder does silence both the Archangel of Wrath and Atraxa, and is probably worth bringing in this match. But again, like I said, it's missing from the data. So my plan is to bring in the 2 copies of Jace the Perfected Mind, the 2 copies of Temporary Lockdown, and the Wandering Emperor, cut the 4 copies of Deduce, and 1 copy of Depopulate. And Jace the Perfected Mind, mill is definitely one way that this very grindy matchup goes. And so being able to mill our opponent out is definitely one of our win cons. Temporary Lockdown looks like maybe it would be a dead card. And again, this is one that was suggested to be sideboarded out, if I remember correctly. And I like having it because, especially for this list, which doesn't have Negate to answer the herd migrations, Temporary Lockdown does. Right? So we can play the Temporary Lockdown after they do a herd migration. So it all depends on what your strategy and what your plan is. But I think Temporary Lockdowns actually work relatively well to answer their threats. And then the Wandering Emperor as well, being able to exile Atraxa, or I guess Atraxa doesn't tap, Archangel of Wrath is decent enough. And then we've got 4 copies of Deduce, which looks not particularly great in this matchup. They're going to largely outvalue us on card draw through the Up the Beanstalk. And then Depopulate is just, we have so many Wraths, I'm not sure that we need to do one on turn 4. Again, the most wrathable board is going to be after the herd migration, and I'd rather do that for 3 instead of 4. And the data seems to agree with that. And then we've got Golgari Midrange. For Golgari Midrange, we can bring in 1 copy of Farewell. Notably, a very favorable matchup for this. Control, Golgari Midrange struggles with Control for sure. And then 1 copy of the Wandering Emperor. And Again, Chromos Siege Arc missing in the data, but we see here that alternative threats like the Hornlock Whale, Ezram Agency Chief could probably be okay if you're running that one instead. But being able to bounce their stuff, we've seen interaction on turns 3 and 4 specifically mess Golgari midrange up pretty effectively. So being able to bounce one of their, Glissa Sunslayers or whatever, works pretty well. And then we've got Elspeth Smite for removing, notably Elspeth Smite exiles, and so that one's particularly good for getting rid of the Mosswood Dread Knights. And then we have Get Lost, which can be good to answer like a Virtue of Persistence, some of the enchantments that Golgari is running, or just hate on their Lily, right? Because Golgari midrange, I think one of the better tools against Azorius Control is Liliana of the Veil, and Get Lost being able to target Planeswalkers is nice. As far as all archetypes go, nothing particularly interesting popping out to me. And then as far as the cards that aren't performing very well in all archetypes, we see Tishana's Tidebinder makes the list. So that's going to be my suggestion, is that we cut the 2 copies of Tishana's Tidebinder and we bring in the 1 copy of Farewell and the 1 copy of the Wandering Emperor. And Farewell is pretty nice for resetting the board once Golgari gets going, being able to exile everything and also the graveyard so they can't bring things back with Virtue of Persistence. They just have to start from square one again, and Golgari midrange has a hard time doing that. And then the Wandering Emperor has some pretty good targets for removing and exiling any of their tapped creatures that they're attacking in. There's not a whole lot of vigilance outside of the map token spawner, Nameless City. So Wandering Emperor's got some good targets. And then Tishana's Tidebinder, though, is we want to survive their early pressure until we get into a board wipe kind of situation where then they have very little chance of winning out. And Tishana's Tidebinder does hit Lily, so you could bring in the Tishana's Tidebinder to try to cancel Lily. Not every deck is going to bring a whole bunch of copies of Liliana of the Veil, though. And so I feel relatively okay with the idea of siding out the Tishana's Tidebinder, because for the most part it doesn't have really great targets to hit against Golgari midrange. And it doesn't have 0 though, to be fair, right? So again, there are many strategies when it comes to sideboarding. Mono red aggro is one that's particularly useful for those who want to play Azorius Control in best of 1. And we can see this is definitely where we want to bring in the 3 copies of the Knockout Blow, bring in the 2 copies of the Temporary Lockdown. Jace, the Perfected Mind, is actually relatively decent against mono red aggro, being able to give them -3, -0, and slow their pressure down. The Wandering Emperor has exiling and gaining life, is particularly good. And then Tishana's Tidebinder, again, has targets in mono red, but isn't great at stopping the early pressure. So generally your Tishana's Tidebinders and things you're going to want to bring in against decks that don't have early pressure, which is why it's not great against the mid-range decks and the aggro decks. So bringing the Tishana's Tidebinders out, I think, is a good idea. And then similarly, we can bring out the 2 copies of Depopulate and the 4 copies of Deduce. As far as alternatives go, we do see that Kutzel's Flanker is the #1 option here that's missing. And that's kind of why I like at least for outside of this deck was built for the standard challenge, and they may not have been anticipating a lot of mono red aggro. When you're climbing the ladder in best of 3 playing Arena, then you're going to play against mono red aggro more often, right? And so I would prefer to have the Kutzel's Flankers so that you can also bring these in instead of just Team or Control. You can bring in the Kutzel's Flankers against mono red aggro. Faithful Mending is an option here for a little bit of life gain. Get Lost for some interaction. No Witnesses is one that's kind of a head scratcher, but that one made it onto the list. And then we've got the Celestis. And no Witnesses is one of those it's a Wrath and can be helpful for wiping the board against mono red. And as far as all archetypes go here, again, nothing new really coming out in the data. Other than Depopulate maybe not being a good one to pull out. And then nothing really new to learn on the bottom here, except for that Deduce should probably be pulled out. And so for mono red aggro, what my sideboard suggestion is to bring in the 3 copies of Knockout Blow, the 2 copies of Temporary Lockdown, the 2 copies of Jace the Perfected Mind, and the Wandering Emperor, and cut the 2 copies of Tishana's Tidebinder, cut the 2 copies of Depopulate, and cut the 4 copies of Deduce. And I think really the reason why Depopulate is not as good is that so turn 4 Wrath can be particularly good against mono red, but if they have Squee, then Squee is a problem, right? Squee is the recurring threat, and Depopulate does not exile, right? And so I think that's really why I would rather be leaning into hitting the Sunfalls that get rid of Squee entirely. Even though it's a turn later, we do just try to stall with our early interaction. So Knockout Blow is a classic sideboard against red, being able to cast it for 1 white to deal 4 damage and gain 2 life, helps us stabilize against their early pressure. Temporary Lockdown has a lot of early threats that can be hit outside of Godric and Squee. And then Jace the Perfected Mind, they can't afford to attack Jace. If they do, then you basically gain 6 life off of them attacking Jace, and they have no chance of winning that game, or very low chance of winning that game. So Jace basically becoming repeatable removal until we stall into a board wipe. The Wandering Emperor being great at removing threats, the Tishana's Tidebinder being bad against the early pressure because of the 3/2 stat block, and then Depopulate, as I mentioned, doesn't get rid of Squee. And Deduce, not really having the time to draw. There's not really that like playing around counter spells thing. They're just going to play into it and try to aggro you. So Deduce looking worse in this matchup. And then next up, we've got Boros Convoke, and we can bring in the 2 copies of Temporary Lockdown, which is the classic sideboard against Boros Convoke if you have white. We can bring in 1 copy of the Wandering Emperor, and we can bring in 3 Knockout Blows. And we've seen this before. Knockout Blow actually works as a sideboard option against Boros Convoke as well. And then our worst performing card is Deduce. And then we get into the sideboard options, and we can see Tishana's Tidebinder not working particularly well against Boros Convoke, which I thought was a little bit surprising, because Tishana's Tidebinder can silence the Knight Errant of Eos as well as the Imidane's Recruiter, but maybe it doesn't work as well as I think it does, and which is why, again, I lean on the data. And so we do see a fair amount of missing options, though, here against Boros Convoke. So we have Teferi, who slows the sunset, which is good for that repeatable life gain. Faithful Mending, which gives you that life gain. You may want to bring in the Faithful Mendings if you are playing best of 1, because it is good against Boros Convoke and mono red aggro, which are very popular picks in best of 1. Kutzel's Flanker, again, like we saw in mono red, would be an option to bring in if you are deciding to run it, and I like that. Make Disappear, being a little bit easier to cast if you are running the Myrixes and be able to actually get it off on turn 2, can help slow their cascade into the Knight Errant of Eos. Same with Disruption Protocol, being able to counterspell their early stuff. Soul Partition to bounce works particularly well, and then we also see the Eternal Wanderer, which kind of gives us an alternative board wipe, works pretty well to leave them with like a 1/1 token. And then all archetypes here, nothing pops out. It's particularly interesting, and nothing really other than we see Tishana's Tidebinder doesn't do well in this matchup as well. So I think what we should do is we should bring in the 2 temporary lockdowns, which is a classic sideboard against Boros Convoke. We should bring in the other copy of the Wandering Emperor. We should bring in the 3 copies of Knockout Blow, cut the 4 copies of Deduce, and the 2 copies of Tishana's Tidebinder. And Temporary Lockdown, being able to wipe their board and leave them with a single Knight Errant of Eos if they got that off in time, is fantastic. And being able, so we should run all 4 copies of Temporary Lockdown. And then the Wandering Emperor has good, exiling their Knight Errant of Eos, exiling their Sanguine Evangelist in particular is pretty handy. Knockout Blow, again, they do have some red targets, so even if you can hit this on a Voldaren Epicure or an Imidane's Recruiter, being able to remove a target and gain the 2 life can help you stabilize in this matchup. And then they're not going to be playing around the counter spells, they're just going to be trying to curve out into their Knight Errant of Eos, so Deduce looking a little bit awkward here, as well as Tishana's Tidebinder, which, again, because Tishana's Tidebinder does have some targets, I thought it would have been good, but it looks like the data would suggest that that's not entirely true. So, pull the Tishana's Tidebinders for the Boros Convoke is the suggestion. So, at the end here, what I like to do is wrap things up with my overall impressions, and so we can see that Chromehost Seed Shark, 3 Steps Ahead, and Rest in Peace are either missing entirely or just had very low data. So that one you're going to have to rely a little bit more on experience than data. Deduce was best against Azorius Control and Esper midrange and Golgari midrange, but was boarded out for Temur Control, Domain, Mono Red Aggro, and Boros Convoke. So I personally like the idea of playing around with maybe moving it to the sideboard and then bringing it in when it is a favorable matchup to do so, instead of starting it in the main, especially with a list that's not running Disruption Protocol and not leaning on the artifact synergies. All copies of Jace, the Perfected Mind, as well as all copies of the Wandering Emperor were brought in for Azorius Control, Temur Control, Domain, so all 3 control matchups, as well as Mono Red Aggro. And all copies of the Wandering Emperor were brought in for Esper midrange, Golgari midrange, and Boros Convoke, while Jace was only taken out for Esper midrange. So, it was definitely next on the chopping block for Golgari midrange and Boros Convoke. So it's not that Jace is like an amazing card, but I would definitely play around with the idea of just starting with all of the copies that we want to run of the Planeswalkers in the main. And we see this a lot in Best of 1, right? You see a lot, 4 copies of the Wandering Emperor, 4 copies of Jace the Perfected Mind. And so I think that that's not bad for climbing the ladder in Best of 3, unless you're coming up against a lot of Esper midrange. And if you're playing in the tournament scene, then you are, right? So I think it makes sense if you're doing the standard challenge to do what they did, which is not started in the main. On the ladder, I think that you should. The other thing too is Rest in Peace doesn't work well in multiples. So, if you have 2 Rest in Peace, they're kind of, they do the same thing. So I think that I prefer the 2 Kutzel's Flankers and the 1 copy of Rest in Peace personally. And since the Kutzel's Flanker works well against Temur Control, Mono Red Aggro, and Boros Convoke. So maybe it's possible that they just weren't anticipating a lot of Mono Red Aggro and Boros Convoke, so they thought they could just do with the 2 copies of Rest in Peace and then get another extra sideboard slot, especially because they have the Destroy Evil in there. It probably makes me think that they wanted to maximize the sideboard slots against Esper midrange. You're going to bump into Esper midrange less in the Best of 3 ladder. So I would bring in the 2 copies of Kutzel's Flanker and take out 1 Rest in Peace and go for the 2-1 split. And then similarly, as I've mentioned, kind of, I'd be tempted to cut the Destroy Evil unless you're coming up against a lot of Esper midrange, since it's really only brought in that matchup. And I also think that it's a weaker card if your Esper midrange lists are dropping the enchantments of Wedding Announcement and Virtue of Loyalty, which makes its only target really Rafine, and then I'm not sure that Destroy Evil is the best option for that in the first place. So, as opposed to just running, Hornlock Whale or something, right? So personally, this would be my take on it for climbing the Best of 1 or Best of 3 ladder. And I hope you found this useful. If you did, remember to click like and subscribe. These guides do take a fair amount of time, so I appreciate you taking the time to do that. It seems like a fair trade-off. And let me know in the comments below if you did find this helpful or if you disagree with some of the sideboards. Sideboards are always interesting discussions, and this isn't, written in stone. I think that this is just, I prefer this to somebody's opinion, and so I have my own bias, right? And, but letting me know in the comments below that this was helpful encourages me to continue to do these in the future. So if you'd like to see these again, let me know, because I have been feeling a little bit burnt out these days, and it's hard to do this sort of stuff for, when I post something like this that I spend a lot of time on, and then I get negative feedback, right? Like I get comments that are like not particularly nice. It's hard, man. It's hard. It's hard out there. So anyway, thank you all for being a part of my community, and I do hope you find these helpful. And good luck with your matches and RCQs and tournaments if you are doing that. Otherwise, good luck climbing the Mythic, and maybe I'll see you on the ladder. Take care, everyone.